Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar where we're going to be covering web filtering in the post-pandemic age and how to adapt to the new normal. My name is Rob Faulkner and I'm joined by Karen Woodhead, who's our Global Marketing Director. And somewhere we've got Tom as well. Are you with us, Tom?
He's having trouble starting his video.
I am here. Apparently the host has prevented me starting my video.
Okay, let me see if I can do that for you. Sorry about that. Right, let's try that now.
There we are.
Great to see you, Tom. Tom's our head of product here at Smoothwal. So Karen's going to be looking after the question and answer. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the question area in Zoom. And whether that's something you wanted to discuss, any clarification on anything we've talked about, or anything really, and we'll get to those at the end. But yeah, just to start off, I think it's really good how many people we've got today. I think it's really, it's really exciting how this topic has really resonated with people. I think for a lot of the general public, they probably think that the effect of COVID on schools is pretty much over, and it's old news really. But it's good to see that you people are still interested in how you can continually improve how you protect your students and keep technology up to date and continually adapt to what are still changing requirements day by day. So what we're going to be talking about today is really the challenges that have been left in that wake of lockdown that a lot of our customers talk to us about every day, some of the solutions for those particular problems, and then, as I mentioned, going back over any questions that you might have, any topics around this that you want to discuss. So from a housekeeping perspective, questions in Zoom, you should see a Q&A button. You can go in there and ask a question. It's totally anonymous, so whatever it is, it's not going to get published out to everyone else. But we will, ask that question to ourselves towards the end. And we'll also have some information at the end of the webinar about a white paper you can download and our contact details if you want to get in touch about anything else. Okay, so as I mentioned, we'll look at the challenges that have been left in lockdown, the solutions. We'll also look at some common myths around filtering in the post-pandemic age, questions and some sources of further help as well. So to start off with, about our challenges, I think you'll be aware of a lot of the challenges that people have faced when it comes to protecting students' online activity and filtering those on devices. I think we all recognise that, at the start of the pandemic a year ago, there was a mad rush to really get devices, whatever we've got available, whatever we can procure, to students so that they can continue to learn from home. But it's left this wake of a lot of problems behind. Some of the problems are that when it comes to providing filtering on those devices, that they might have gone out without any filter on them. They might have had whatever was the easiest, lowest risk, cheapest thing available to go out onto those devices. They might have even gone out as unmanaged devices, which
we saw a lot of that, didn't we, Rob? During the first months, particularly as schools picked up devices from a variety of sources. We were working with a local charity here in West Yorkshire, where the majority of Smoothwall folks in the UK are based. And of course, they were getting devices to schools, but schools would get Chromebooks when they would traditionally be a window shop. Schools were getting what they could from charity, from some from the government and some from their own purchases, and it wasn't always the devices that they were used to having.
No, exactly. They might have acquired these devices but had no in-house skills or technology to manage those devices. So yeah, they would go out and would effectively allow the student to do whatever they want, install whatever they want on that device, and providing any kind of management or control over that could have been quite difficult. So I know a lot of schools over the summer and into the current academic year have sort of rolled out technology around that to help manage that, but it's still an ongoing process for a lot of people. One of the things when it comes to filtering as well that we've heard a lot of is that particularly if they had acquired some other filtering solution just to deal with the remote devices, that was kind of done in a hastily way and didn't go through a proper process to evaluate what was appropriate filtering for these. So there are certain concessions I'm sure that people make that say, if students take home a device from school, then actually when they're at home, YouTube's probably okay. We probably wouldn't want them doing it in school, but it's at home. We're probably doing it in the evening, that's okay. But the overall kind of discussion with senior leadership and other stakeholders within the school around what is and isn't appropriate might not have happened. And that might have been led by what the technology can do rather than what the appropriate safeguarding needs are of the school. So that's something, a big challenge we've seen. I think that, that this kind of mountain of laptops that have has appeared over the summer has been a challenge for a lot of schools as well when it comes to, if they had gone out unmanaged, how to get them back in, how to bring them under management control so that they can be locked down and restricted as much as is necessary. That's been a huge challenge for a lot of schools.
And I think we recognise, Rob, that while some schools got a mountain of laptops, others were left with rather more of a molehill.
Exactly, yeah. I think in some ways it's a good problem to have. But yes, you're absolutely right that those that were not fortunate to get that, have obviously missed out there. I think as well that kind of feeds into different types of device as well. Some schools would have had the luxury of saying, well, we are a Windows Office 365 school and we just got Windows devices for the students. That's again a bit of a luxury. It was very much a what can we get for the cheapest and quickest possible way. If we can get handouts from local charities, as Tom mentioned, then great. But they might have been Chromebooks. I almost said Macs then. Quite unlikely there would have been Macs. But Chromebooks, iPads, Android devices, a whole range of different stuff. And how do we then sort of wind that back and wrap that management and control over that estate of devices that we've got? And really, the management one is a really critical one, because when it comes to controlling web access, filtering, when we're in school, that's kind of quite easy. I say quite in inverted commas, but because we control the internet connection and the network, we can apply that filtering, near the router, at the edge of the network, and say anything going out onto the internet is filtered. But when those devices are at home, we don't have that level of control over the network. So there's only one other way that we can control those devices, and that's manage that device itself. So that's where things like Google G Suite, Intune, Active Directory Group Policy, MDMs, things like that come into play to say, we don't have control over the network these devices are in, so we must have control over the device itself. And really everything we talk about, that safety starts with controlling that device. So it is a real crucial linchpin to providing off-site remote filtering.
I don't know what the folks here have experienced, but certainly some of the tales we've heard from people we've been working with around how the difficulties of Active Directory centric networks to transition to that remote management has been, with AD not being very good once the device leaves the network. We've seen some frankly quite ingenious methods for people to either get hold of laptops, get access to them, make changes on them, and it's been really impressive how the school IT community has responded to those challenges. But what do you say, Rob? Do you think that's caused people to move forward in things like Azure AD and G Suite as opposed to AD?
Yeah, definitely Azure AD and Intune. I think they were seen as a technical curiosity before the pandemic. If I want to learn more about cloud technology, I might roll out Azure AD or Intune in the school, but there was never a real business need to do that. It was more of a casual thing. But almost overnight, that's turned into a key skill set that schools have been developing. And yeah, I mean, we see it almost all the time now that schools are using Intune, Azure Active Directory, and many are even looking at dropping their on-premise domain controllers and things like that, simply because, you know, much like with filtering, you don't want to be running two things at once and managing two things at once. You don't want a separate solution for filtering devices off-site than filtering them on-site. Likewise with Active Directory, you don't want to be managing an Active Directory group policy for on-premise devices and an Intune Azure Active Directory for remote ones. So that consolidation of the kind of strategy when it comes to IT management is something that's, you know, really important now, and really is really important because, you know, remote working, remote learning is here to stay. You know, we've opened up the possibility now by force, really, to work from home and learn from home, and that's not something that's going to disappear overnight. It's going to be here for a very long time, and you know, there are lots of benefits to that I'm sure people are reaping as well. So, you know, it's really good to address these challenges rather than think of them as challenges that go away once everyone is vaccinated and we can forget about the whole thing. You know,
well, I know we've seen from across the pond, the New York public schools have said now there's no such thing as a snow day anymore. It's remote learning. Of course, snow day in New York, where it can get rather chilly, is a bit more common than slightly aggravating slush day that we get here occasionally. It'd be interesting to hear your comments on where you're working. Are people starting to think about remote learning and remote working for reasons other than the pandemic?
Excellent. So, you know, we've talked a bit about the challenges. Tom's going to take us through the kind of road ahead now. So yeah, I'll hand over to Tom.
Thanks, Rob. So just to kick off with, really, before we talk about how you might want to apply filtering, particularly in a remote scenario, I want to introduce you to a concept that we've been working on in Smoothwal. It's a concept you might have seen in the white paper that accompanies this webinar, and we call it the filter safety pyramid. I know it's a step above a matrix in terms of being something that we've all seen these types of diagrams, but we think it's a useful kind of graphic to show the level of risk that you might be exposed to from a safeguarding perspective. So we start at the bottom with obviously the easiest thing to do, which is get these devices out there with no filtering when they leave the network, which of course comes with it the maximum exposure to any risk. Moving up there through DNS filtering, which we'll talk a little more about later as a technique when we look at the techniques of remote filtering. But as we know, DNS filtering leaves unseen a number of things within a web request. So, for example, DNS filtering only sees the domain; it doesn't see the URL path. DNS filtering only sees the google.com domain; it doesn't see the search terms that a student's searching for. So, has a great deal less power in terms of its efficacy in safeguarding situations, and it's very much more difficult to get accurate logging out of DNS filtering. So when it comes to examining those situations after the fact, that exposes you to a fair degree of risk if you're considering a DNS filter as a solution. Moving up through there, we go slightly more technology agnostic and into URL filtering, where any generic filtering system which relies on a list of URLs and can at least see past the host, past the DNS, and into that URL, still carries some exposure to risk. We believe that in the most part, those risks, they're in that red section there, rather too risky. Say in the most part because, you know, for example, during the rush to get devices to young people so they could actually continue learning, folks have used that. You know, the Department for Education pushed those laptops out with DNS filtering on. That was probably a good move on their behalf. It was better than nothing. It was better than being in that no filtering category, and something needs to be done real quick. So, you know, we understand why that occurred. Moving up from a URL filtering, we look at content-aware filters. We see these in a lot of cases now where a URL that's not classified will be passed back to the filtering vendor. that will look at the content and be aware of what's on that page and make a decision based on that, and that decision will be passed back to the filtering device to understand what that page actually content wise is. Content aware filtering leaves only partial exposure to risk, but up there at the top of the pyramid, we've got real-time content aware filtering. So that's where the filtering device or agent itself is actually looking at that content in real time, and that minimizes the exposure to risk, because when something's looked at on the basis of go and look at this URL and determine whether the URL is pornographic or it's news or it's education or whatever category that might be, when you do that, you look at a point in time. So obviously sites on the web change hugely day to day, so you look at a point in time. When you do that, you look at something where you're not logged in as the same user. So if I log into Twitter and you look at my Twitter feed, you'll see a whole bunch of different content if you log into Rob's Twitter and look at Rob's Twitter feed. Yeah, probably a bit different, aren't they, Rob? So looking at that as a third party, you just look at twitter.com and you wouldn't have a login when you go and scan this site. When you do your content analysis, you wouldn't do that. So that's why we say 100% real-time content aware. So in real time, looking at that actual content that is being requested at that time minimizes that exposure to risk. Again, there are methods of doing this all of the time and to all of the traffic, and there are methods where we don't do this all of the time to all of the traffic. We've got to consider those when we look at balancing our risk. And as we always say, when you're looking at safeguarding, it's all about looking at the risk on the one side and how difficult it is to do something on the other side and balancing between those two things. So that's going to come into all of our discussions about what the best way to do filtering is keeping that risk and inconvenience balance, and that might look different for BYOD and it might look different for managed devices. Okay, so I think next up we're going to talk a little bit about how Smoothwal chose to address remote filtering, and then we're going to look at the types of cloud filter. So Rob, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide, I'll do Chris Whitty and not have a clicker. So Smoothwal chose an agent-based approach to cloud filtering. So I'll go through these. I'll talk about why we elected that particular type. So an agent-based type of cloud filter, you can tell you've got agent-based filtering for remote filtering by the fact that you've installed an agent on that device. So by that we mean we've installed a software client or agent on the student device. We've got other types of DNS filtering. So you can tell you've got DNS filtering when there's no filtering on the URL path or search terms. There's the type which I call big proxy in the cloud, where we're basically saying we're going to use the same proxying technology as we used to use at the edge of our network, and we're going to put that into the public cloud somewhere. We want to point all your traffic at it. You can tell if you're using a big proxy in the cloud type because the traffic that you transmit doesn't come from your IP. So if you visit what'smyip.com or what have you, you'll see a different IP to which you expect, and you'll have set up a tunnel, or it should say VPN, but clearly C is rather too close to that on the keyboard there. That's me. Any apologies. And you'll also see that these big proxy in the cloud situations tend towards higher cost because you're tunneling traffic up into the public cloud and doubling the bandwidth bill. Yeah. You'll also see a combination of DNS and big proxy in the cloud sometimes. It'll feel generally like a DNS proxy, usually from ease of install, but you'll generally need man-in-the-middle certificate deploying to that device because these combination filters do DNS filtering on the vast majority, and then for interesting sites like Google, they'll redirect that to the big proxy in the cloud. Why do they do that? Well, they do that because the big proxy in the cloud is a high-cost way of achieving filtering, so we don't want to push everything through there because it doubles that bandwidth bill, and someone's got to pay for that at the end of the day. So instead, we say, well, most things we know that are allowed, we just let that go straight out from the user's device. Then there's some things we know are definitely blocked. We'll block that at the user's device. And then there's some things that live in a gray area. We'll push them out through the proxy, and we'll do that man-in-the-middle SSL decryption, and we'll look at those Google search terms, and we'll make an assumption based on those there. So those are the 4 broad types of methods of doing remote filtering. We chose the agent-based type, and I think you can probably identify from thinking about the safeguarding risk pyramid there why we chose that. DNS comes towards the bottom in terms of its efficacy against safeguarding concerns. The big proxy in the cloud method, whilst common in big corporates, and they start to get involved in zero trust networks and all that sort of fun stuff these days, incredibly expensive, comes with the big price tag, which isn't suitable for an education environment. A combination DNS and big proxy, they're quite clever, quite like them. But they still suffer from the same problems as we often suffer with proxies. What are those? So those are HTTPS filtering, seeing inside that encrypted traffic. We at Smoothwal know that over time it's going to get harder and harder to see inside encrypted traffic. Google, Microsoft, Cloudflare, Amazon, all the big players on the internet, they want to make it harder to see inside encrypted traffic. Frankly, all of us want them to make it harder to see inside encrypted traffic, except on those days when we're working in education. Yeah, when we're outside of that education environment and we're using our own devices, we'd rather it was much more difficult for other people to examine that traffic. But when we're in education, there's that dilemma that says we want to see inside that traffic, and that's something that we feel that the pull of that is pulling generally towards the fact that it's going to be more difficult, and maybe even impossible over time. So, for example, installing a MITM certificate on an Android device or an iPad or whatever have you doesn't gain the trust of all the apps. So you can't see inside that app traffic. So you can see inside less traffic than you can before. It's more difficult than ever before. So that's one of the reasons why we avoided anything involving a proxy, because anything involving a proxy has got to involve MITM. Anything involving MITM is going to give us a closing door of information and gain out of it.
So Tom, if you had a crystal ball, how far ahead in the future do you think we'd be looking at a situation where man-in-the-middle certificates, just wasn't feasible for the vast majority of devices?
I mean, if there's a question I was hoping not to be asked, folks, that was kind of it. My predictions have been fairly ropey of late. I predicted that Leeds would beat Brighton and then get beaten by Spurs. That didn't work out. What would I predict? I think we've probably got sort of between 3 and 5 years before we really start seeing this becoming difficult. Protocols don't mature that fast, but we've seen TLS 1.3. We've seen that with the encrypted SNI headers. We've seen DNS over HTTP make a few inroads. You start to give people options to avoid being decrypted, and that's the way you usually see things travel. Is you start to see folks get the option to move, and then the option becomes mandatory, and over time we forget that we ever had those capabilities at all. So, I think we're headed there quickly on unmanaged devices, and probably 3 to 5 years on unmanaged. So that's the MITM SSL side of it. The other interesting piece of web filtering, particularly in schools, is authentication. So we always want to know who's doing what. It's really important from a safeguarding context. It's no good getting an alert out of your web filter to say that somebody's visiting sites around the topic of radicalization, for example, and that somebody is 192.168.10.30. I mean, how we're going to catch that guy? No idea. We need to make sure everything is authenticated. It's particularly difficult to authenticate devices, even more difficult than it used to be. And it's when you're outside of your own controlled network, that becomes borderline impossible. So you can do it with your big proxy in the cloud. You can probably wrap up in that VPN tunnel some sort of authentication that's going to work. With DNS, there's no option for that. You might, at the very best, segregate people into a few groups. And with these combination filters, sometimes you might get a little bit of an idea of who's who. Again, down in that bottom right corner there, thinking about agent-based, when there's an agent on the device and we've logged somebody into the device, whether it be a Chromebook or a Windows PC or a MacBook, we know who's logged into that because it's a managed device. So that gives us that authentication piece. So that's why we headed down this agent-based route, because we not only do we want to solve the mobility question, we wanted to solve the man-in-the-middle SSL question, we want to solve the authentication question. I have said here that not all agents are created equal. One thing that you will see, there are different categories of agents. So we've gone in browser, others have gone run a proxy, a mitten proxy in the same context as the browser. So you'll see antivirus software often does this when it does the antivirus scanning of browser traffic. For me, that's moving the problem around. You've still got that problem of doing it at the network layer. You do gain some advantages from that, however. So we'll talk a bit about those in the myths section when we're discussing compromises. So I think we've covered types of cloud filter fairly thoroughly there. Another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of our approach to cloud filter is we approached it from a hybrid position. We didn't approach it from, hey, let's just all go to agent-based filtering, let's all go to things that are in the cloud. We said this is something where a rising tide must lift all boats. So those who've got existing Smoothwal on-premise devices, we want that to work with, not work against. And we want to make sure that as we add functionality, so for example, we've just added some functionality into to improve YouTube's filtering. As we add functionality that adds into both, and as new things occur, that rising tide lifts all boats. So folks who are using the on-prem device get those same improvements that are using the cloud, and we don't just pivot and focus on one.
I think it's something that, when we talked about that kind of mad rush for people to just get something, and people ended up having perhaps different filtering on the remote devices to what they had on the sort of school fixed devices, that kind of inconsistent results were challenging. Some websites might be allowed here and not there, or even if those remote devices come into school, they might get some very strange results because they're being filtered twice according to two separate sets of policies and filtering rules. So I think that consistency is, really important. So yeah, I think that's a key thing that, as we look towards remote staying here, that, consolidating that and getting a consistent approach is really valuable.
I think these first two myths, very nicely presented. Thank you, whoever did this slide. I wrote some text and someone made it look nice. It's brilliant. These first two myths are kind of two sides of the same coin. So there are folks out there who tell you can't have a single filtering solution for cloud and on-premise. We say, think about hybrid. It's possible to join the two. It's possible to have a cloud filtering agent on a device that tells your on-premise device when it's being filtered and lets that through, so you don't get that double filtering effect. If these two can talk to each other, we can have a much more powerful system. We can have an on-premise device that's there to manage things like Byod, or desktop devices that don't need to have an agent on for mobility, and then we can have those agents for mobile devices, and those can live together seamlessly. So you definitely can have a single filtering solution for both, even though a lot of people, as Rob alluded to during the first months of the pandemic, ended up with two separate systems, often through no choice of their own. There's another myth that some of these pure cloud filters that have been advertised have no compromises. We believe there is a compromise with everything. We believe even the route we've taken with an agent-based filter has its compromises. So in our case, that's compromises around. Because we're in browser, we want to we have to support different browsers, and there are some browsers we can't support and some browsers we don't support yet. So there are always compromises with anything that you do. If you end up with a DNS filter, of course, you'll be compromising on that safeguarding efficacy. If you end up with some of these types of filter that work well on managed devices only, you might compromise on BYOD or even the other devices that are fixed devices within your school. So we believe a hybrid approach is a good approach. We believe a hybrid approach that puts the school's idea of where they want to go and how fast they want to move and what levers they want to pull is a good approach. As we spoke about earlier, there's always that lever that you can pull between safeguarding and between things being sort of simple and easy. And for different types of devices held by different types of people, it's our philosophy to make sure that that lever is in your hands and that you can choose where you want to be. And we think that there are those compromises that when you go full cloud, that should be compromises that are only ever made with full knowledge. You should understand exactly what's going on and exactly what you will get, you won't get out of a filtering and safeguarding system. Another myth we often hear is people who hate proxies. And I guess I sort of count myself amongst the people who hate proxies, but it's only because I've been in this filtering game for long enough that you start dreaming about network proxies in your sleep and thinking about them the first thing you wake up in the morning, and they start to get on your nerves a little bit, and you start thinking, I wish I'd never seen a proxy in my old life. But anyway, there are people who tell us that proxies are old-fashioned technology, proxies are no good, and this is a fancy new cloud world and there's no such thing as proxies. But you'll actually see from the glance we did over the different types of remote filtering, a great many of them still use proxy technology under the hood, whether that be an agent that's running with a proxy in the background, whether that be a proxy that's running at the other end of the VPN but is in the cloud, whether that be a proxy that's occasionally backed off by a DNS filter. They're still there. Yeah. It's worth knowing that, so you understand what does that mean for the efficacy of the filtering you're doing. What does that mean for how you're going to roll it out? What are those compromises that you might need to make because that exists? We've put KIXI compliance automatically means safe filtering, kind of a weird one here. Like who quite knows what KIXI compliance is? How do you kind of define that? How are you sure that exists? The reason we've put that in here, one thing KIXI say, the KIXI guidelines say from the Safer Internet Centre, is that you shouldn't use anything but network edge filtering. And we think they've got a point in that network edge filtering, as Rob said earlier, is great because you know that nothing's going to get out of your network without passing through the filter. But that's kind of yesterday's ideas. When we now have to have folks who are outside the perimeter of our network, like how can we filter them? You can't just say you must use a network edge filter. You can't in that situation. So the guidelines probably will end up being updated, but in the meantime, it's worth saying keep those guidelines in mind. I think they speak to the hybrid system being a good idea, and they also have that sort of the right philosophy behind them. And that combines really with the final myth we'll cover. You don't need to filter devices that leave school. I think, again, this is something the pandemic's taught us, that you can't let devices go outside of school for a couple of reasons. We've seen people with inappropriate content coming back into the school, stuff that would be blocked in school, coming back into the school. And we've seen safeguarding issues that happen on an evening that would ordinarily not be picked up. So I think it's really important that devices are filtered when they leave school, particularly school-owned devices, which is, school-owned devices that leave the building are much more common now than they were 18 months ago. We haven't really got any decent government guidelines on these yet, but the fact that the DFE felt it necessary to provision filters on the laptops that they provided, I think gives us a direction of travel for guidelines going forward. So, I'm sure there are people in this country who are going to say we're not going to filter devices going home. I think they'll find themselves I'm not going to say on the wrong side of history, but on the wrong side of the government guidelines going forward.
Yeah,
And that, with a bit of a croak in my voice, is probably about it for me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, obviously, we've worked with, a lot of customers over the last year to roll out remote filtering. And even though nobody has said you have to remotely filter these, I think everybody understands that there's a duty of care that they have and that it's simply the right thing to do. So hopefully, that the legislation will back that up in due time. But I think we're all on the same page, really, and singing from the same hymn sheet.
I think we've got a couple of questions actually coming in on regarding iPads. Mark, Louise, you're talking about monitoring, but we can come back to that. But Mark's asking about how we filter on shared Apple Mac devices, as using the Chrome extension forced by G Suite doesn't apply. And I don't believe currently there is a Mac client stroke agent.
So there is a Mac agent. So we can give that a shot. So I presume, Mark, you're an existing Smoothwal customer. There is a Mac agent. It's arguably less mature than our Windows agent. We'd love to work with you on solving that problem. So if you can drop us a line to the email address there on the screen, or if you know your customer service manager, drop them a customer success manager, drop them a line, and we'll get that answered for you offline.
Fitz is asking as well, does the death of MITM proxy-based filtering sound the death knell for school BYOD? And how does Smoothwal suggest filtering guests and unmanaged devices? I
think it doesn't sound the death knell, but for me, it puts a warning sign, danger all who enter here. BYOD and MITM are uneasy bedfellows at the best of times. Right now, if you wanted to put a certificate on those devices, you can, but you have to get the students to be involved in doing that. It can be quite challenging, particularly challenging in independent schools, where BYOD seems to be more prevalent. We are seeing a swing back into managed devices, and I think this is part of it. There are those folks who go, right, we're going down an all managed device route, no BYOD. And then there are those folks who are saying, we're going to allow BYOD for some set of the students, and we're not going to do MITM filtering on it. And because of that, we're going to drop ourselves down that pyramid, but we're going to do that with that risk known and understood. But yeah, I think it will make BYOD less popular fits, absolutely.
An anonymous question, and similar to what Anthony's asking as well. Anonymous says, we use Smoothwal Filter and Monitor. Works great for us on Windows, Chrome devices. We don't have many Macs are not tested. When will the agent be expanded to cover other device types such as Android? And I know iPads are a different beast. Yeah, we know.
So if there were a single computing device that I could press a button and remove from the face of the planet, it would be these things. I do not like iPads, but there you go. I didn't buy this one. I'm not turned. It's Smoothwal owned. Please don't judge. We are building an iPad agent. It will be a filtered browser. We looked at 13 or 14 different methods of doing some filtering on an iPad. Apple do offer some APIs. Those APIs basically allow you to give Apple a bunch of URLs and they'll block them for you. They won't tell you when they've blocked them, and they won't tell you who they've blocked them for. So really not fantastic in a safeguarding environment, because if someone, say, visits a website that we know contains material pertaining to self-harm, we're going to want to alert the school on that. But if we can't get that alert, that's not really much good.
I think it's not always about blocking, is it? It's about, safeguarding is not shut the door and stop them getting on these websites. It's about allowing them onto them, but if there is anything of concern, then flagging it. So that could, as Tom says, be them going on to, Samaritan's website, or it could be them, simply searching for advice with anorexia and bulimia. These are not things you want to block, but they are things where you want to have a safeguarding intervention. So, back to that pyramid, down the bottom of that pyramid, it's near impossible to be able to do that kind of stuff.
So yeah, we've got a Mac iPad browser in the works. A couple of things have changed to make this possible. We've seen filtered browsers before. We've all not liked them before. We still don't like them, but we think they're the best thing you can probably do at this stage. The things that have changed are in iOS 14, Apple have allowed third-party browsers to be the default browser. So before, if you blocked Safari, you basically had a bad time. Now, if you have a third-party browser, you can have a good time. And other complaints about filter browsers are the browser itself is rubbish, and that's kind of true because most people have spent a load of time on filtering and not much time on the browser, so the browser sucked. We have forked the Firefox open source browser, so it's actually a really good browser underneath, and somebody else is maintaining the browser, which is great. So it actually be a high quality browser and able to be the default. So we think that'll work well for iPads. We've just got that in very, very early beta test. We've just got for the first time Apple have approved it onto their store, but not for public consumption just yet. So fighting with Apple's approval process is our current hobby.
Louise, you had a question about that with regards iPads and monitoring. Because we're talking filtering today, I'm going to respond to you offline about that question and give you a roadmap for that as well. And just following on from that question, Tom, Anthony just says, we're using the client filter on Windows machines. Is there an Android equivalent?
There is not an Android equivalent at the present time. We are quietly hopeful that at some point Chrome on Android will support extensions and allow us to deliver the extension to Android. Some of you might know Google are in the process of rebuilding the APIs which extensions can use with something called Manifest v3. This removes a lot of things we use in the extension at the moment. It's quite irritating. Luckily, they've given us 18 months notice, so we've got someone working on that. We believe that this might be the path to them opening up extensions on Android. So we hope that will occur. That's something we're doing a bit of a waiting game on for a few months to see if that changes. There are already Google browsers out there, Android browsers out there that do support extensions, notably Yandex and Kiwi browser, but neither of these seem to also support the MDM, which you would need to control the use of browsers.
I think it's fair to say it's something that we don't see a lot of Android devices in use in schools. It's obviously over the last year been growing for all the reasons we were talking about earlier. But anybody that is using Android, we'd love to speak to understand more about how they're using that and how we might be able to solve that problem in the future.
Right, I don't think we've got any more questions.
Okay.
There was one in the chat, I believe, from our good friend Mr. Watters. Hey Nick. Long time no see, hope you're good, mate. So Nick has asked, with you looking at moving to a hybrid solution with filtering moving to the device for most devices and the Smoothwal managing Byod and firewall, what are your plans to update the firewall functionality in the Smoothwal, especially VPN and layer 7? So I'll address those sort of twofold. VPN, we will be updating the VPN capability fairly soon. In our next major release of Smoothwal, which is called Maiden, updates the kernel in the on-premise Smoothwal and allows us to offer some different VPN types, which would indeed allow you to do that proxy in the cloud type configuration by yourself if you wanted to do that with a VPN. Layer 7 wise, it's an interesting one. So layer 7, sometimes called sort of next generation firewall. Or application awareness in a firewall is an interesting one, and one where much like network inspection for HTTPS, it's got the same problems because most traffic now is encrypted. Up to sort of 95% of traffic that goes through a Smoothwal on a day-to-day basis is encrypted, and most of that encrypted traffic is on port 443 and looks like encrypted HTTP because it is. Layer 7 and other kind of next-gen firewall tools are increasingly poor at determining what traffic is. So I think there'll be use of things like that and things like IDS and IPS, I think will fade over the next couple of years, and we'll have to look at different ways of controlling stuff in our networks, and a lot of that will likely be agent-based.
We're up to time. What I will say is if this discussion has been really useful, and if you think that there's more questions you want to ask, or you want to talk to Rob and Tom in more detail, we can run this again, or we can do a Zoom. If you want to drop me an email, inquiries@smoothwal.com, I'm on the other end of that email. So if anybody wants to come forward, we can set up a smaller group Zoom, or do another webinar if you want to carry on this conversation. And I will just say that this has been a very quick fly through of a more detailed paper that we've written on this topic. So we're going to email that to everybody anyway, so you've got it, and we'll email you the recording of this session as well. And I'm sorry that there's some more questions been coming in that we've not managed to answer, so apologies for that. But the guy Tom and Rob are always here. That email's always open straight into my inbox, and any questions of any kind, even if it's just to chew the fat over a particular issue, we're always ready to help, because we're kind of all in this together. And this technical understanding around filtering is very specialist. So the more we collaborate with everybody, and you collaborate with us, and we share our knowledge, the better it is for all of us. And of course, it's safer it is for kids, ultimately.
It'd be awesome to have a bit more of an interactive roundtable if we can get a smaller group together. So anybody's interested, please come forward, and we'll put something together where we can sit around a virtual table and have a bit of a chat over a cup of coffee, and see what everybody's experiences are.
Let me know if you're interested, everyone, and I will certainly get that set up. No problem at all. Okay.
Excellent.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Tom. Really interesting.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Karen. And thanks, everyone else.
Any questions, just drop us a line.
Cheers, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.